On this episode of The Shawn Ryan Show, the audience is taken on a journey into one of the most incredible survival stories ever told. The guest, Keith Stansell, lived through nearly 2,000 days of captivity in the jungles of Colombia, held by the FARC guerrillas. For over 5 years, his life hung by a thread as he endured hunger, fear, brutality, and despair. But what makes his story so powerful is not just what he survived, but how he held on to his humanity, his faith, and the hope of one day returning home. This is the full breakdown of his conversation with Shawn Ryan. Keith doesn't begin with bragging or sensationalism. He speaks with humility, setting the stage with his childhood. His mother's death from cancer when he was just 14 shattered his world. Losing her at such a young age made him angry, bitter, and distrustful of life itself. His father did his best, but was distant, unable to fill the emotional void. Keith grew up hardened and restless. That pain carried into his young adulthood until he found an outlet in the Marine Corps. The Marines gave him structure, discipline, and a sense of belonging. It was there that Keith learned the toughness and mindset that would later keep him alive through the darkest days of his captivity. After his time in the Marines, Keith transitioned into civilian life, but eventually found himself working as a contractor in Colombia. His job was dangerous, flying counter-narcotics missions over coca fields. These were not safe patrols. Planes flew low, vulnerable to ground fire, while also carrying the weight of political controversy. He explains that their mission was not just about drug eradication, but about destabilizing a system propped up by cocaine money. The guerrillas thrived on corruption. Poor farmers were often presented as victims, but the real profiteers were FARC commanders, drug traffickers, and politicians who turned a blind eye. Shawn pushes him to describe the tension in those missions. Keith recalls the constant stress, engines straining in thin jungle air, tracer rounds streaking past, and the knowledge that at any moment a hit could bring them down. And then it happened. On one mission, their aircraft lost power while already under fire. The pilot, Tommy Janis, performed a miracle by crash landing in a valley. That decision saved Keith's life, but it also delivered him and his crew directly into enemy hands. Within minutes, they were surrounded by more than 100 armed guerrillas. 2 of his crew, Sergeant Cruz and Pilot Janis, were executed on the spot. The horror of seeing his teammates killed in front of him marked the beginning of Keith's own nightmare. From that moment, Keith's life, as he knew it, was gone. He and the remaining survivors were marched into the jungle. Guards pushed them at gunpoint, and every step further from civilization felt like another chain tightening around his future. For 1,967 days, over 5 years, he would remain a prisoner. Life in captivity was brutal. Keith describes the endless marches carrying loads through rain, mud, and oppressive heat. Hunger gnawed constantly. They were given barely enough food to survive, often scraps that left them weak and sick. Disease was rampant. Mosquitoes, infections, and jungle rot made every day physically miserable. But the greatest weapon used against him wasn't physical, it was psychological. The guards repeatedly told him rescue was impossible, that the world had forgotten him, that he would die in the jungle. Days blurred into months, and months into years. Time lost meaning. Keith says he survived by holding on to small mental victories. Each morning, he told himself, "I'm alive, that's enough for today." There were moments where death seemed certain. One of the most terrifying came when the guards lined him and the other captives up for execution. Rifles were raised, orders shouted. Keith describes the shift inside him. Fear gave way to pure anger. Instead of pleading, he walked toward the gate and shouted at his captors, daring them to shoot him like a man. That act of defiance stunned the guards. For reasons Keith still can't explain, the order was called off. That defiance became symbolic of his entire survival. He refused to let the FARC break his spirit, even when they controlled everything else. But the pain of captivity was not only physical or immediate. Keith missed some of the most important years of his life. During his time in the jungle, his twin sons were born. He didn't meet them until they were 5 years old. For years, he imagined the moment he would hold them, using that vision as fuel to keep going. He says it was the thought of his children and the hope of reunion that gave him the strength to push through when he felt he couldn't take another step. Shawn asks him about the broader political picture. Keith explains that FARC, once seen by some as revolutionaries, had long since become a cartel. They used hostages like him as bargaining chips. At their height, they held over 400 soldiers, police, and civilians in jungle camps. Peace negotiations came and went, often freeing guerrilla leaders while the hostages languished. Some leaders were even given seats in Congress as part of peace deals, only to later return to violence. For Keith, it was evidence that some groups can't be negotiated with. They aren't freedom fighters. They're killers. After years of torment, the rescue finally came. The Colombian military launched one of the most audacious rescue missions in modern history. Disguised as humanitarian workers, they tricked the FARC into handing over their most valuable hostages. Once on board a helicopter, the soldiers revealed their true identity. "You are free," they told Keith and the others. That moment was overwhelming. Keith describes the rush of disbelief, joy, and relief as he realized the nightmare was finally over. Coming home was not simple. After 1,967 days in captivity, Keith had to adjust to freedom all over again. He had to rebuild relationships, learn to be a father to sons he'd never met, and carry the weight of trauma that doesn't just vanish. Yet, he doesn't tell his story with bitterness. Instead, he frames it as a lesson in resilience. He believes humans are built to endure more than they can imagine. Even when every external comfort is stripped away, the will to survive can carry you through. He says if he could go back and talk to his younger self in the jungle, the message would be simple but powerful. This, too, will pass. Shawn also presses him on faith. Keith admits that during captivity, his relationship with God deepened. Faith became his anchor. When the jungle tried to convince him that he was forgotten, prayer reminded him that he wasn't. That spiritual strength, combined with his determination to see his children, carried him through. Today, he speaks openly about his Christianity, not as a preacher, but as someone who lived through hell and found faith as his only light. The conversation also touches on gratitude. Keith says people often waste their lives chasing comfort and forgetting how fragile freedom really is. After losing 5 years of his life, he never takes small blessings for granted. A meal, a hug from his kids, a quiet night at home, all of it feels sacred. His story is a reminder that freedom, family, and love are treasures we overlook until they're gone. By the end of the episode, Shawn Ryan reflects on the weight of Keith's story. Listeners are left with a sense of awe, but also responsibility. Keith's testimony is not just about his personal survival. It's a warning about the evil that exists in the world, and a lesson that even in the worst circumstances, resilience, hope, and faith can carry us through. Keith Stansell may not call himself a hero, but his story is heroic. He endured hunger, fear, isolation, and despair, and came out the other side with his humanity intact. His 1,967 days in captivity stand as proof of what the human spirit can overcome. And that's the essence of this episode of the Shawn Ryan Show. A reminder of how fragile life can be, how strong people can become when pushed to the edge, and why gratitude for freedom and family should never be taken lightly. If this recap moved you, make sure to subscribe for more podcast breakdowns every week. And if you don't have time for 3-hour episodes, my TikTok page has quick summaries that deliver the same insight in just a minute or two. This channel is your place to experience the best podcasts in 10 minutes.